a raging river,
The Columbia is a force of nature.
a dry wasteland,
The most harsh desert in the whole United States.
and desperate days.
One of the blackest periods in its history.
They just took a big chance.
The deals, the danger, and the inspired engineering that made a desert bloom.
Remarkable transformation of this entire region.
The biggest thing on Earth.
The Grand Coulee Dam. I'm Stuart Varney, and this is American Built.
Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on.
Woody Guthrie wrote, "Roll on, Columbia," to celebrate the great Columbia River. But as it twisted its way through the Pacific Northwest, the Columbia needed little help to get the water where we needed it most.
Eastern Washington State. The mighty Columbia River flows down from the Canadian Rockies, cuts across Washington and out into the Pacific. But as it turns west, the river bends by an ancient dry riverbed called the Grand Coulee.
The Grand Coulee was actually left by the Ice Age floods. The canyon is 50 miles long and about 900 feet deep.
For thousands of years, that coulee was dry. The land around it, the Columbia Basin, was a barren and mostly uninhabitable landscape.
This is the most harsh desert in the whole United States. The 6 inches of rainfall won't grow anything, and you haven't lived till you've been hit by a tumbleweed right in the face.
Washington settlers long imagined that if they could use the river to fill up the Grand Coulee, the massive lake created would irrigate the Columbia Basin. Unfortunately, there was a mountain between the river and the coulee.
There were two groups that emerged that had this idea to bring water to the Columbia Basin. One group became known as the pumpers, and one group became known as the ditchers.
The ditchers proposed a series of canals from Lake Pend
That was called the gravity plan. In other words, don't put a dam on the river, just let the gravity bring this canal down here.
But Lake Pend was almost 200 miles away from the Columbia Basin. The Columbia River provided another option. It flowed within 1 mile of the empty Grand Coulee. The trouble was that mile was uphill.
The pumpers, on the other hand, envisioned blocking the Columbia River, forming a lake behind the dam, and then actually pumping water up into the Grand Coulee.
The pumpers believed that a dam would create a reservoir and generate enough power to pump water from that reservoir 280 feet up into the coulee. From there, the water could flow out to the rest of the Columbia Basin. The ditchers had the support of the man who built the Panama Canal, George Washington Goethals. But the pumpers had a high-profile ally too, local newspaper publisher Rufus Woods.
Rufus Woods was really powerful. They had to defeat the gravity plan, and it took at least 20 years of fighting. Rufus Woods knew about the importance of irrigation water and what it can do.
What it could do was transform the Pacific Northwest desert into an American Eden. Add in some hydroelectric power, and the Columbia Basin could become an industrial hub too. But in the 1920s, there weren't enough people in Washington to use the power.
There was this notion that it was a white elephant, that it would flood the market with electricity that no one needed.
Woods lobbied hard for federal support. Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover all seriously considered the Coulee Dam proposal, but all three ultimately decided the timing wasn't right.
There was a 22-year fight just to build the dam.
But the Depression changed everything.
The United States faced one of the blackest periods in its history. It was in the grip of what is now referred to as the Great Depression. Millions of unemployed besieged the government for relief.
FDR came to power, promising to put people to work with big government projects.
He was very much looking for ways to put Americans back to work, and Grand Coulee was definitely in the right place at the right time.
It was exactly what Roosevelt was looking for, a shovel-ready project that required an awful lot of shovels. Roosevelt authorized $63 million to build a dam that was lower than Woods had hoped, but he'd take what he could get.
The thought was if construction on the low dam started, they would see people put to work, and they would see that a higher dam would be possible.
The Bureau of Reclamation put their best man on the job, Chief Engineer Frank Banks.
Frank Banks was the resident engineer for the Bureau of Reclamation, and by the time he gets to Grand Coulee, he'd actually been building dams for 30 years.
But before Banks could start building, he had to deal with a serious HR problem.
Thousands and thousands of men came here. They didn't have a home, they didn't have relatives, they just took a big chance.
People started showing up in the area. There were no accommodations. People would live in their cars, they'd bring tents.
To house his crews, Banks built two separate towns, Mason City for laborers, Engineers Town for the engineers. While Banks built the infrastructure, Rufus Woods ratcheted up public support. He convinced FDR to visit the site.
They hadn't even stuck a shovel in the ground, but the hope was there. They had about 20,000 people waiting for him to give a speech.
We are creating power, more power. And I always believe in the old saying of more power to you.
The Grand Coulee Dam became the symbol of FDR's New Deal. It absolutely had to work. Even the First Lady felt the pressure.
He brought Eleanor with him. She said, "You are so stupid to build a dam up here. Nobody lives here."
Eleanor Roosevelt apparently made the comment to Franklin that it must have been a good salesman that sold this place to Franklin.
Rufus Woods sold the idea. Frank Banks had to make it a reality. To support the dam, he had to excavate down to the bedrock. That meant hauling out an unprecedented 22 million cubic yards of dirt and rock. So Banks set up a massive system of conveyor belts, the largest in the world. And the more debris they removed, the further the conveyor belts had to go.
This was the biggest conveyor system that had ever been installed in the world.
But before he could build the dam to stop the river, Banks had to stop the river to build the dam.
The Columbia is just a force of nature. I mean, it's this ever-present danger that you face out there.
To hold back the water, engineers had to build temporary barriers called cofferdams. And those cofferdams absolutely had to be completed in the winter, when the river was at its lowest.
If those cofferdams are not secured before the spring runoff, they're really in danger of losing everything.
The Grand Coulee crews raced to build the cofferdams before the spring thaw.
By the time spring would roll around, the force of the river and the flow of the river would be much, much too high to try to construct these cofferdams.
If they weren't complete and they weren't secure, they would be destroyed.
They completed the cofferdam just days before the river swelled to 32 feet above its normal height. The ambitious Grand Coulee Dam would harness the power of the Columbia River and pump water uphill into an ancient dry riverbed called the Grand Coulee. From there, that water could irrigate the Washington High Desert. But the river would not yield without a bitter fight.
One of the things that plagued the construction was the dirt. This was a very loose material. It would actually slide.
To prevent hillside collapse, Chief Engineer Frank Banks used an old mining trick. He piped in ammonia and froze the land. Once the cofferdams were in place, the governor showed up to pour the first slurry of concrete for the dam's epic foundation. Governor Martin even got paid for the work. His check for an hour of labor came to 75 cents. With the concrete flowing, engineers had to deal with another problem.
And what they learned is when you place concrete in mass, it shrinks over time, and when it shrinks, it wants to crack.
To prevent cracking, banks ordered the concrete laid in hundreds of individual blocks.
In a construction project like the Grand Coulee Dam, every block of concrete had to pull its weight.
And every man had to risk his life. 60 men died building the foundation alone. In the dark days of the Great Depression, more than 8,000 men found jobs at the Grand Coulee Dam, but the work wasn't easy.
Hot summer, cold winters. But I still can't believe what those guys put up with to work here.
The noise would be deafening, the dust would be choking. By the end of the day, these workers would be exhausted.
The winter of '35 wreaked havoc on the men and the fresh concrete.
Some of the original concrete froze, which meant the workers had to come back in and chip all of that out and redo that section.
And another spring thaw brought yet another complication.
When that cement and water come together, they produce a reaction that causes heat. If that heat is not controlled while the concrete is curing, it can cause the concrete to crack.
To cool the concrete, Banks used the water from the river to his advantage.
There were thousands of miles of 1-inch pipe cast into the concrete so that while it was curing and producing that heat, water could be run through those pipes and carry the heat out.
But as the concrete set, one thing became clear. The record-setting dam was not nearly big enough. The Grand Coulee Dam used more concrete than any construction project in history. But it still wasn't enough.
A decision had to be made. Do we go with a lower dam or the high dam?
A 290-foot dam would never generate enough electricity to pay for itself. Chief Engineer Frank Banks realized he needed to build the dam much higher.
A high dam would create more electricity, which would mean more revenue.
But more than that, a high dam would produce enough power to irrigate the high desert. In a higher dam, the water falls further, spinning the turbines faster. This would create enough power to sell and to pump up into the Grand Coulee. From there, it could flow throughout the region. That was Rufus Wood's real dream. But President Roosevelt only agreed to pay for a 290-foot dam. So once again, the newspaper publisher rolled up his sleeves.
The Wenatchee Daily World covered the construction, sometimes almost on a daily basis.
The public wanted to know, well, how are they doing? How's it moving? And so he would take that and put it into words and publish it so people could read it and understand that, yes, we have to keep the momentum going with the tax money.
His campaign paid off. Congress agreed to pony up for a 550-foot dam. Woods got the funding for Banks to finish the job right.
So as Grand Coulee began to rise, a lake began to form behind Grand Coulee Dam.
But the higher dam came with a higher human cost. 17 more men died building it, and the larger reservoir it created displaced thousands.
Over 56,000 acres were inundated around the lake. That displaced people, both tribal people and settlers. The Grand Coulee Dam means many things to many people. There is struggle. There are also benefits.
The higher dam also required bigger pipes called penstocks to control the water flow.
The penstocks are constructed of circular tubes, and those actually had to be shipped in by rail. And then they are actually put together on site, and the dam is built around these penstocks. So yes, everything with Grand Coulee is big, including the penstocks.
But those penstocks would mean nothing unless the water they carried could be transformed into electricity. A single power plant was not nearly enough to handle the power from a 550-foot dam. So Frank Banks built a second power plant on the other side.
The total capacity of the original turbine generators there at Grand Coulee was about 2,000 megawatts, which was quite remarkable for the time.
On March 22, 1941, the 550-foot Grand Coulee Dam was finally ready to power on.
The biggest thing ever made by man goes to work for mankind.
It had taken 11 million cubic yards of concrete, $163 million, and the lives of more than 77 men.
About 45 million man-hours of labor had been expended on the project, so it was certainly a time to reflect and look back on this great achievement.
But there wasn't a lot of time for looking back. The power was on, but the job was only half done. The main point of the project was to irrigate the high desert. Unfortunately, before those pumps could be built, the dam got pulled into a very different mission.
We're going to be awfully lucky we've got that dam.
Grand Coulee Dam was originally built for irrigation, and irrigation was sidetracked for a little while when the dam was completed and the first power came off the dam.
Before the Grand Coulee Dam could begin its life in agriculture, it got drafted into World War II. The American war machine had to gear up in a hurry. The Air Force needed planes. Planes needed aluminum. And aluminum plants in the Northwest needed power.
At the end of 1941, the shift was then from irrigation to power for World War II.
A lot of people would tell you that the reason we won World War II was because of the Grand Coulee Dam.
At the time of World War II, the Grand Coulee Dam produces most of the electricity in the Pacific Northwest, which was critical to the war effort.
When the war ended, Washington farmers finally got their dam back. But getting the water from the reservoir 280 feet up into the Grand Coulee would require yet another major engineering feat, a system of electric pumps.
So we then began pumping the first irrigation water up a 280-foot embankment to a canal which led to Banks Lake.
Banks Lake, named in honor of Chief Engineer Frank Banks, is the crowning achievement of the dam. This was the Grand Coulee, that ancient dry riverbed high in the desert. From this height, a network of aqueducts carried the water throughout the Columbia Basin.
I wouldn't be sitting here today if it wasn't for that Grand Coulee Dam. There couldn't be a successful agricultural business. There's no way you could live in this central part of this state if we didn't have a Grand Coulee Dam.
Towns that were once desolate became thriving metropolises. The Pacific Northwest was born. In 1950, President Truman dedicated the reservoir above the dam to his former boss, naming it Roosevelt Lake. But FDR and Frank Banks weren't the only ones to get a new lake named after them. The newsman got one too. This popular fishing hole created by the dam is called Rufus Woods Lake. The Grand Coulee Dam was finished 2 years ahead of schedule. The Bureau of Reclamation proudly returned the $16 million in savings to the U.S. Treasury. They hired legendary folk singer Woody Guthrie to write a song about it.
Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on.
He was a well-known folk musician, and I think he had a lot of broad appeal throughout America, and kind of put a face on Grand Coulee.
The workers that constructed the dam showed a lot of pride in the work that they did. They knew that they were working on something big.
Columbia, roll on. And on up the river, the Grand Coulee Dam, the mightiest thing ever ever built by man.
Something that we can take pride in 80 years later, 150 years from now. We'll still be able to take pride as America in what our people are capable of doing when given the opportunity.
Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness